400 square blocks, 28,000 buildings, $500 million in property, $3 trillion in today's money, all destroyed in 3 days. The San Francisco earthquake of April 1906 lasted less than a minute. The fires that followed burned for 3 days. When the smoke cleared, the city was gone. What remained was rubble and chimneys, square miles of devastation that looked like a war zone. And the immediate question was, how do you rebuild an entire city? The answer was lumber. Millions of board feet of lumber, enough lumber to build 50,000 houses, which meant cutting 50,000 trees, large trees, old-growth redwoods from forests that had been growing for centuries. Within weeks of the earthquake, logging operations throughout Northern California were working at maximum capacity. Entire forests that had stood for hundreds of years disappeared in months to provide the lumber to rebuild San Francisco. This wasn't gradual logging spread over decades. This was industrial-scale forest clearing driven by a city's desperate need for materials. 50,000 trees, gone in a year, all to rebuild one city. This was San Francisco in April 1906, and the city had just experienced one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. The earthquake struck at 5:13 in the morning on April 18th. The shaking lasted between 45 and 60 seconds, depending on location. Buildings collapsed, gas lines ruptured, water mains broke. And most catastrophically, fires started throughout the city. With water mains broken, there was no way to fight the fires effectively. The fires spread, merged, and created firestorms that consumed everything combustible. For 3 days, the city burned, while firefighters could only watch helplessly. The final damage toll was staggering. 4.7 square miles of the city, about 80% of San Francisco, was destroyed. Over 28,000 buildings burned or collapsed. The death toll was officially listed as around 3,000, but was likely higher as many deaths went unrecorded. 300,000 people, 3/4 of the city's population, were left homeless. The economic damage was about $500 million in 1906 currency, equivalent to roughly $15 billion today, though the true replacement cost would be much higher. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The streets were filled with rubble, broken masonry, twisted metal, collapsed wooden structures. The downtown business district was completely gone. The financial district, where banks and offices had stood, was nothing but brick ruins and iron safes sitting in ash. The residential neighborhoods that had covered the hills were burned to foundations. Only chimneys remained standing, creating an eerie forest of brick columns across the hillsides. The fire had been so intense that metal had melted and stone had cracked from heat. Glass windows had melted and run like water. Wood buildings had burned so completely that in many areas nothing remained but ash and nails. The fire had created temperatures hot enough to consume everything combustible, leaving only the heaviest masonry and metal as evidence that buildings had existed. The human displacement was overwhelming. 300,000 homeless people needed immediate shelter and food. They say
the
Army
mature
established
coastal
relief camps
redwood,
in parks and
300
open
feet
spaces.
tall and 20
Tent
feet in
cities
diameter
sprang
at
up
the base,
where displaced residents
contains
lived
enough clear
in military
lumber to
tents
build
or makeshift
40
houses.
But
Golden
in
Gate Park
1890,
became a massive
that
refugee
tree
camp,
didn't become
housing
houses by
thousands.
thinking positive
The
thoughts.
Presidio military base
It became
housed
lumber
thousands
through a
more.
process so brutal.
The relief
and
effort
so
was the
technically
largest
ambitious
humanitarian operation
that
in
each
American
step,
history to that
from
point.
the moment a surveyor
But
marked the
tents
trunk
weren't a long-term
to the
solution.
moment a
San
finished
Francisco's
board
climate
left the
includes
planing
fog,
mill, rain,
was
and
its
cold
own
ocean
engineering
winds.
problem. The
Wrapped
refugees
in a
needed
body
real
count.
housing before winter. We're talking about
The pressure
turning
to start
a living
rebuilding was
skyscraper
immediate
that weighs
and intense.
500 tons.
Within days of the
Rooted
earthquake,
in terrain
city
so
planners
steep
and business
a man
leaders
can barely
were meeting
stand
to discuss reconstruction.
into finished boards. The
Delivered
consensus
to San
was that
Francisco
rebuilding
or
had to
Chicago
start immediately, using
It had to
technology
proceed
that
rapidly,
hadn't advanced much,
and it
beyond
required
axes,
enormous quantities of
saws,
construction materials
and steam, particularly lumber.
No chainsaws,
The architectural
hydraulic
planning for the
equipment,
rebuild happened quickly.
no trucks. Some visionaries
Just
proposed
iron,
grand redesigns,
wood,
wide
muscle,
boulevards,
and a willingness
classical
to
monuments,
accept casualties
comprehensive
that would shut
planning.
down a modern operation.
But practical
before
considerations won out.
This isn't
The
the
city
story
would
of how
rebuild
they
largely
cut the
on its
trees
existing
down.
street grid.
This is the
using
story of the
conventional
complete
construction.
journey.
This
From the
meant
moment
wood
a
frame
timber
buildings
cruiser marked the
sheathed
red in
wood
various
the fog
materials,
belt of Humboldt County,
constructed using
to the
standard building
moment a
techniques.
surfaced, plain,
And that meant
braided
lumber.
board was loaded onto a
Vast
ship
quantities
bound
of
for
lumber.
market. More lumber than
Every
had
step
ever
was
been needed by a
impossible.
city in such a short
Every
time.
step was solved.
Could you really
and every
rebuild
step
an entire
cost
city in a
lives.
year using lumber from
Let's start with
forests
the asset.
hundreds of miles away?
Because understanding what a coastal
Could
redwood
logging
is
operations ramp up
helps you
fast
understand
enough to
why
supply
every
millions
stage
of
of the
board feet of
process was
lumber on demand? And could you do it without modern equipment, relying on steam-powered mills and horse-drawn wagons to move materials? The answer is yes. The evidence exists in the rebuilt city itself, in lumber company records documenting the extraordinary production increases of 1906 and 1907, and in the forests that disappeared, stumps and bare hillsides where old-growth redwood forests once stood. Before we get to how the lumber was supplied, you need to understand the scale of what needed to be rebuilt. Because this wasn't just replacing a few destroyed buildings. This was reconstructing an entire metropolitan area from rubble. The immediate housing need was overwhelming. 300,000 homeless people needed shelter. The city established refugee camps, tent cities where displaced residents lived while the rebuilding began. But tents weren't adequate for San Francisco's climate, especially with winter approaching. The city needed houses, 20 to 30,000 houses in the first year, just to provide basic shelter for the population. Each house required perhaps 10,000 board feet of lumber, the wood from 20 large trees. That's 400,000 to 600,000 trees just for emergency housing. But the housing was only part of the lumber demand. The commercial district had to be rebuilt: stores, offices, warehouses, factories. The infrastructure had to be reconstructed: wharves, railroad buildings, utility structures. And this wasn't a gradual process. The city needed to rebuild quickly because every day without functional commercial buildings was lost economic activity. The pressure to rebuild fast was intense. The lumber demand was calculated by architects and builders in the weeks after the earthquake. The estimates ranged from 500 million to over 1 billion
Sequoia
board feet of lumber
sempervirens,
needed in the
coastal
first year.
redwood.
To put
The
that in
tallest
perspective,
trees on Earth.
1 billion board feet.
The groves
represents
along the
roughly
Northern California coast,
200,000 large
from Big
trees.
Sur to the Oregon border,
Each tree 24
contained
inches in
trees
diameter
that had been growing
and
since
80
before
feet
the
of
Roman
usable
Empire.
trunk. The
300
entire
feet
annual
was
lumber
not
production of
unusual.
California before the
350 feet
earthquake
was documented.
was about 2 billion
Heights
board
were
feet.
hard to measure accurately because
San Francisco
the crowns
needed
were lost
half
in
of the
fog.
state's annual lumber
But when the
production
big trees fell
just for the
and could
first
be
year
measured
of
on the
rebuilding.
ground, the numbers
The source
were
of this
staggering.
lumber was obvious:
20 feet in
coastal
diameter
redwood
breast
forests
height,
of northern
30
California.
feet at the base where the buttress swell
Redwood was
began.
ideal construction
Bark,
lumber.
it
a
was
foot
straight-grained,
thick,
relatively
wood that was
soft and easy to work,
straight-grained,
light,
naturally resistant
strong,
to decay and
insects,
so resistant to rot
and available
and
in
insects
large quantities
that fence
in
forests
posts
within a
cut
few
from
hundred
redwood
miles
in
of San
1860
Francisco were still
The redwood
sound
industry
in
had been
1960.
supplying the city's lumber needs for
The
decades.
economic value was
But
obvious.
now the demand would increase
so was the
exponentially.
problem. The logging
These
companies
trees grew
responded
in a narrow
immediately.
coastal fog belt.
Within days of the
on
earthquake,
slopes that
mill
averaged
owners
30
and
to
logging
40
operators
degrees,
were planning how to
sometimes
increase
steeper.
production. The terrain
The goal
was a
was
tangle
to
of
at least
undergrowth,
double output.
fallen logs
From perhaps
from previous
5 million
storms,
board feet per week
creeks
across
and
all
ravines.
operations.
There
to
were
10
no
million
roads,
or more.
This
No
required
towns,
hiring additional workers,
no infrastructure,
extending
The trees
operations to new
themselves
timber
were so
stands,
massive that standard
running
logging
mills at
techniques
maximum
didn't work.
capacity.
You couldn't
and
just
creating
chop one down
transportation
and haul it
infrastructure
away.
to move lumber
The
to
weight
San Francisco
alone defied
as
every
fast as it
tool
could
and
be
method
cut.
that worked on other species.
The lumber prices
A Doug
responded
fir
to the
might
demand.
weigh 10 tons.
Before the earthquake,
A big pine,
redwood lumber might
20.
sell for $12 to $15
A redwood
per
could weigh
1,000 board feet at
500.
the mill.
500
After the
tons.
earthquake, prices
That's the weight
jumped
of
to
a loaded
$25
freight
to
train.
$30, and it's a
Double the
single
previous
log
price.
Turning that into
At these
lumber
prices,
required solving a
every
series
lumber
of
company in
cascading
Northern
problems,
California wanted
each
to
one bigger than
maximize
the
production.
last. The profit potential
Step 1 was enormous.
finding the trees
a large
and getting
mill
to them.
producing 10 million
The timber
board feet
cruisers
per
went in
year
first.
at increased prices.
These were men who worked
could
alone
earn an
or in
additional
pairs,
$150,000
walking through the uncut forests,
$4.5
marking
million
trees
in modern
estimating
currency,
volume
just from the
mapping
price
terrain.
increase. They carried
The
axes
logging
to blaze
operations
trail
that
marks.
supplied the rebuild
Notebooks to
were
record
concentrated
data,
in
and
several
rifles
regions.
because the forest had
The
bears and
primary
mountain
source
lions,
was Humboldt County,
and the kind of isolation
heart
where
of
if
the
you broke a
redwood
leg,
forest.
you died.
This
cruiser
region
would
had
mark a
extensive
tree by
old
chopping
growth
a blaze
stands
into the
and
bark
established
and
logging
stamping it with the
infrastructure.
company mark.
Then
Companies
he'd
like
estimate
the Pacific
height and
Lumber
diameter,
Company,
calculate
Dolbear
the board
and Carson,
feet, and mark it
and
on his
numerous
map.
smaller operations,
The best
ramped up
cruisers
to
could
maximum
estimate
production.
volume within 10%.
The
just
second
by looking.
source was Mendocino County.
They were paid by the
south
acre
of Humboldt,
surveyed, with
maybe
similar
50
redwood
cents an
forests
acre,
and logging
and they
operations.
covered ground
The
fast.
third source was Santa Cruz County.
surveying
Mountains,
was the
closer
easy
to
part.
San Francisco.
Once a timber
With
tract
smaller
was marked,
redwood stands,
it had to
but
be
convenient
accessed.
transportation. That meant roads. The
Not
standard
highways,
logging operation in
skid road.
1906 was
A skid road
transitioning
was
from
a path
pure
cut
hand
through the
methods
forest,
to steam-powered
graded as
equipment.
flat as possible,
but it was still
surfaced
largely
with
dependent
small
on
logs
manual
laid
labor
perpendicular
and
to the
horsepower.
direction of travel.
Trees were felled
Corduroy,
with
they
axes
called it,
and crosscut
because the
saws
surface
by
looked
hand
like corduroy
fallers.
fabric.
The logs were
Building
hauled
a
by
skid
horse
road
or
through
ox
redwood
teams
country
along skid
meant clearing
roads,
undergrowth,
or by donkey
removing
engines,
stumps,
cutting
steam-powered
grades and
winches
hillsides,
that could drag logs
and bridging
long
ravines.
distances.
It was done by
The logs
hand.
went to sawmills powered by steam engines or water, where they were sawn into dimensional lumber, 2x4s, 2x6s, boards for siding and flooring. The felling of large redwoods for the rebuild followed the same techniques used in normal operations, but at an accelerated pace. Two fallers would approach a tree and assess it, determining the fall direction, planning their cuts, positioning their springboards if the tree was large enough to require cutting from height. For trees over 10 feet in diameter, springboards were essential to get above the massive buttressed base. The fallers would chop undercuts, huge notches extending 5 or 6 feet into the trunk, taking days to complete on the largest trees. The pressure to increase production meant cutting corners where possible. Normally, fallers might spend extra time ensuring perfect undercuts and precise fall direction to minimize damage to surrounding trees. After the earthquake, the pressure was to fell trees as fast as possible. If a falling tree damaged nearby standing timber, that was acceptable collateral damage. The goal was maximum board feet per day, regardless of waste or damage to future timber. The donkey engines that hauled logs revolutionized post-earthquake logging. These were portable steam engines with large drums of cable. The cable would be run out to logged areas, attached to logs, and then wound in, dragging logs to a central landing where they could be loaded onto railroad cars or trucks. A donkey engine could move logs that would have required dozens of horses or oxen. The engines were expensive, several $1,000s each, but they paid for themselves through increased productivity. The logging railroads were extended rapidly after the earthquake to access timber farther from existing infrastructure. Temporary railroads, built quickly with light rails and sharp curves, penetrated into previously inaccessible forest areas. Crews with axes, saws,
locomotives on
shovels,
these railroads
and
were
blasting
small
powder.
and specialized.
A good crew
designed
could
for
cut a
rough
mile
track
of
and
skid
steep
road
grades.
in a month. The rail
difficult
cars were
mile,
flat cars designed to
steep
carry
with
1 or
multiple
2
ravines,
massive logs
contained
to
to
3
their
months. The log
The
landings
roads had
where
to be
logs were
engineered
gathered
for the
before
loads
shipment
they'd
to
carry.
mills became scenes
A
of intense
500-ton
activity.
log on a wooden sled
Dozens of
pulled by
logs
a
might
steam
arrive
donkey,
hourly,
generated
dragged by donkey
forces that would
engines or
destroy
hauled
a
by
poorly
teams.
built road in a single pass.
The landing crews would separate
So
logs
the roads
by
were
size
overbuilt,
and quality,
the logs
using
massive,
log brands,
the
marks
surface
chopped or
constantly
burned into the
maintained.
log ends to track ownership.
While the
better
road crews
logs went to
worked,
mills that could
the camp
cut high-quality
crews built the
infrastructure.
Lower
Bunkhouses
quality
for the
logs
men
went to mills making
cookhouse,
rough construction lumber.
a blacksmith shop for tool
The speed
repair,
of log processing at
a
landings
stable
increased
if they were
dramatically
using
after the
animals,
earthquake, as
a
mills
boiler
demanded
house
continuous
if they were using
log
steam.
supply. The
These
scaling
camps
of
were
logs,
temporary, measuring
built
them
to
to
last a
determine
few
board
years
feet
until the
content,
nearby timber was cut,
done at landings
then
by
abandoned.
specialized workers called
The buildings
log
were
scalers.
rough.
Lumber
A
slabs
scaler would
for
measure the
walls,
diameter at the
shake
small
roofs,
end of the log
dirt
and its
floors.
length.
They housed
Then
100
used
men or more,
calculation tables
and
to
they were built in
determine board
weeks
feet.
because time was money.
The scaler's
and the
measurements
companies wanted
determined
timber
payment to
moving.
loggers and charges to mills.
Step 2.
In
Felling.
the post-earthquake rush,
Bringing the tree down.
scaling was sometimes cursory.
You've heard some of this before
with
if you
rough
know logging
estimates
history,
substituting for
but the
precise
scale
measurements.
matters.
A redwood
led to
felling
disputes,
operation was
but
different
kept
from felling
logs
other
moving.
species.
The transportation
because
of size
logs
and the
from
wood
landings
properties.
to mills used various
The first
methods.
problem was the buttress.
For mills on the coast,
Redwoods swell
logs
at
might
the
be
base,
dumped into the ocean
trunk
and
flaring
formed
out
into
in
massive
rafts.
lobes,
Massive
that can add 10
assemblies
feet
of
to the
thousands of
diameter.
logs chained and
You
bound
can't
together,
saw through a buttress
then
efficiently.
towed by tugboats to
The
mill
wood
sites.
is too wide and too irregular.
A log raft might
So the
contain
fallers
a
had to
million
work
board
above
feet of
the
lumber
buttress,
worth
$6,000,
$25,000, sometimes 10 feet
For
off the
inland
ground.
mills,
Logs
meant
traveled by
springboards.
railroad or were floated down
faller
rivers
would chop a
during
notch
spring high
into the
water,
trunk, angling upward.
The work week
About
in the
3
logging
inches
camps
deep
increased
and 6
after the earthquake. Before April 1906, camps typically worked 5.5 or 6 days per week. After the earthquake, many operations went to 6.5 or 7 days to maximize production. The pressure was constant. Mill owners wanted logs. Fallers were pushed to cut more trees faster. Mill workers ran equipment longer hours. The economic incentive was strong enough that workers accepted the brutal pace despite the increased danger. Among the loggers who worked during the post-earthquake lumber boom was a man named Henrik Larsson, a Norwegian immigrant who worked in Humboldt County from 1903 to 1912. Larsson's letters to his family in Norway, preserved by descendants, describe the work and the accelerated pace after the earthquake. From July 1906, the logging camp where I work has doubled in size since the earthquake. We are now 140 men. We work 6.5 days per week. The pace is brutal. We are cutting trees as fast as humanly possible. The mill demands logs constantly. If we do not produce, we are told, San Francisco cannot rebuild. This pressure is constant. I am earning good wages, $4 per day, which is more than before, but the work is exhausting and dangerous. Already this year, we have lost 3 men to falling accidents. Last week, a man named Sven Olsen was killed by a widowmaker. A large branch fell from a tree we had just cut. It struck him on the head, and he died instantly. We buried him at the camp cemetery and continued working. There is no time to mourn. Larsson's letters also describe the cutting of particular groves. We are working in a grove of redwoods that has never been logged. The trees are enormous, some 20 feet across at the base. They stand 250 to 300 feet tall. Then he'd jam
These
a
trees have
springboard
been
into
growing
the
for
notch.
centuries.
A plank
Perhaps
of wood
1,000
4 to
years.
6 feet long, and we
Shot
are cutting
on one
them all
end
with a metal cleat that
The
gripped
entire
notch.
grove will be gone by September.
The plank stuck straight out
It
from
takes
the
our
tree.
crew of 10
The
fallers.
faller stood
about
on it.
3 days per
The
tree
plank
for the
flexed
largest
under his
ones,
weight, but held.
2 days for the undercut.
2 fallers,
one day
on each
for the
side of the
back
tree,
cut.
would each have a
We
springboard.
are felling 5 to
positioned
6
at the same
trees
height
per week
facing
per
each
crew.
other.
The
Standing
mill
on
can
these
barely
boards,
keep up with
6
the logs
feet or
we are
more off the
sending.
ground. They'd begin the
A
undercut.
later letter from November
The
1906
undercut was chopped with double
describes
bit
the conditions
axes.
and the moral
A
conflict.
wedge-shaped notch on the side of the tree.
work continues
facing the
without
direction
respite.
you wanted it to fall.
We have cut over 200
The notch
trees
had to
from
be
this
deep,
grove alone.
a third of the diameter
The
or more,
forest that stood
and
here
precise.
for centuries is now
The
stumps
angle
and
controlled the
slash.
fall. Too
I
steep,
feel some
and
shame
the tree
at this
would sit
destruction.
back and bind the
But what
saw.
choice do I have?
Too shallow.
This
and
is
you
my
lost
employment.
control.
I need the wages.
Chopping the
And
undercut
we are
on a
told
20-foot
the
diameter
lumber is
redwood
desperately
took
needed in
days.
San Francisco.
Not hours.
The newspapers say
Days.
thousands are
The
still
fallers
living
would
in
swing
tents.
in rhythm.
If
One
our
man,
lumber helps
then the
build
other,
houses for those
ships
people,
flying.
perhaps the
The
cutting
wood
of
was
these
soft
ancient
compared to
trees
hardwoods,
is justified.
but there was so much of
But
it.
standing among the stumps,
Every swing removed
seeing
a
the
few
devastation
pounds.
we have created,
The undercut might
it is
require
hard to feel
removing
proud of
several
this work.
tons of wood.
Another
And you were
documented
doing
logger
it
was
standing on a
Patrick
plank
O'Brien,
6 feet in the air,
an Irish immigrant
swinging
who
an
worked
axe
as a
that
logging
weighed 4
superintendent
pounds.
in Mendocino
Thousands
County
of swings.
from 1904
in fog
to
and drizzle,
1910, because the redwood belt
O'Brien's
is always
diary,
damp. Preserved in a historical
Once the
society
undercut was
collection,
complete,
describes
the
the
back cut
management
began.
challenges of
The
ramping up
misery
production.
whip.
From
crosscut
May 1906,
saw.
8, 10,
I have received
sometimes
orders
from the
12
company to
feet
double
long
our
for the
log
big
production
redwoods.
immediately.
We are
2
to cut
men,
everything
one on
of
each
commercial
end,
size in our
pulling in
current
rhythm.
tract. No
The
selection,
saw only
no
cut
leaving
on the
a seed
pull trees,
stroke.
just clear cut
Push
the
and you
entire
buckle the
area
blade.
as fast as possible.
The
The fallers stood on their
I have been
springboards,
authorized to hire as
pulling
many
the
men
saw
as
back
needed
and forth,
and to pay premium
back and
wages.
forth.
The
Cutting
company
from the
expects
backside of the tree
100,000
toward the
board
board feet per day from our operation starting next month. To achieve this, I must hire another 50 men and purchase additional equipment. The capital investment is substantial, but the company believes the lumber prices will justify it. O'Brien's entries also describe the worker management. Managing 100 men in a logging camp is challenging. Most are hard workers, but some are troublemakers. Last week, I had to dismiss 3 men for fighting. Yesterday, a man came to me drunk during working hours. I sent him down the mountain immediately, with instructions never to return. I cannot allow disruption when we are under such pressure to produce. Every day of lost production represents thousands of dollars of foregone revenue. From September 1906. We have been operating at maximum capacity for 4 months. The tract we are logging is nearly exhausted. We have cut over 15 million board feet from this area, perhaps 3,000 trees. What was dense forest is now bare hillside covered in stumps and logging debris. Next month, we will move to a new tract 10 miles north. The company has purchased timber rights to another 5,000 acres. At our current rate, that represents 2 years of logging. By 1908, all the accessible timber in our region will be gone. The company will then have to decide whether to invest in extending our railroad into more remote areas or to close this operation. A third documented worker was Chin Lee, a Chinese immigrant who worked in sawmills in Mendocino County from 1902 to 1915. Lee's testimony appears in Labor Commission records investigating working conditions. His account describes mill operations during the rush. According to the testimony, I work as a lumber sorter at mill. I start work at 5 in the morning and finish at 9 at night, 16 hours. 6 days per week, sometimes 7. The mill runs constantly after earthquake. The noise is terrible. The saws screaming, the steam engine pounding, the lumber crashing down. Many workers are injured. Last month, a man lost 3 fingers to saw blade. He was so tired he made mistake. The kerf, another man was struck by falling board and broke his arm. Had to be kept clean. The company pays no compensation for injuries. If you cannot work, used wedges. You are dismissed. Pounding them into the kerf behind the saw. Lee described the working to hold it open and to apply pressure. The sawdust is tilting the tree air toward the undercut. We breathe it constantly. Redwood is fibrous. Many workers develop cough. The saw would gum up with pitch. The mill is hot from steam engine. Every summer becomes unbearable. The would stop. We are allowed 2 breaks per day. Apply kerosene or oil to lubricate the blade. There is no time for meals during work. We eat on a big tree while sorting lumber. The back cut could take 2 days. I am paid $2 per day, which is less than white workers who do same job. Not continuously, but I need work, but in shifts. I accept this. Many Chinese workers when your shoulders gave out or your hands blistered because white workers will not accept the wages and all of this while standing on a springboard. Another documented logger was Thomas McBride, that if the tree started to go before you were ready, who worked as a sawmill foreman to pull the saw in Mendocino County, grab your gear and get off to 1913 before hundreds of tons McBride's of wood diary entries from 1906 and 1907 reading a redwood for the fall described the mill operations. The trees often leaned, but not always in the direction you wanted. From August 1906, wind was a factor. The mill is running so high that wind at crown level operate 16 hours per day, when the ground was calm, shutting down only for maintenance. Internal rot was another variable. We have increased our crew from old redwoods often had 50. Hollow centers. We are producing approximately 150,000 board feet per day. A tree could look solid and have a rotten over 1 million per week. Shifted the weight distribution. This is double our pre-earthquake production. The fallers looked for signs. The lumber goes directly to San Francisco by ship. Listen to the wind. We can barely keep up with the demand. And then the railroad is screaming for lumber once the back cut was started, you couldn't stop. The city is rebuilding. Eventually, every builder wants lumber immediately. The wood between the undercut and the back months of production, the hinge, got thin enough that the tree's weight overcame the resistance. McBride describes the wear on equipment. You'd hear it. The mill machinery is suffering from the constant operation, like a gunshot but lower. The saw blades dull quickly. Then a tearing sound as the hinge fibers begin to separate. We're sharpening the main saw twice per day instead of once. The carriage that moves logs through the saw is developing problems from continuous use. We make repairs at night while shut down for maintenance. But equipment is failing faster than we can fix it. Last week, the main drive shaft cracked from fatigue. We had to shut down for 2 days while we replaced it. 2 days of lost production represents 300,000 board feet of lumber, $15,000 of revenue lost. The transportation of lumber from the mills to San Francisco was a major logistics challenge. The primary method was shipping by boat. Lumber would be loaded onto ships at mill towns along the coast: Eureka, Fort Bragg, Santa Cruz. The ships would sail to San Francisco and unload at the rebuilt wharves. A typical lumber schooner might carry 200,000 to 300,000 board feet, the production of a large mill for 2 days. Dozens of ships were operating constantly, creating a continuous flow of lumber to the city. The railroad also carried lumber, though less efficiently than ships.
The Northwestern Pacific Railroad connected some mill towns to San Francisco. Lumber would be loaded onto freight cars and shipped south. A freight car could carry about 20,000 board feet. A train might have 20 to 30 lumber cars, delivering 500,000 board feet. But ship transport was preferred, because ships could carry larger loads more cheaply. The lumber yards in San Francisco were overwhelmed with activity. Lumber would arrive by ship or train and be stacked in yards for distribution. Builders would come to buy lumber for specific projects. The yards ran constantly, operating from dawn until dark. The lumber trade became one of the most active businesses in the post-earthquake economy. The specific forests that were cut to supply the rebuild are documented in lumber company records and in forestry surveys. One of the largest sources was the Bull Creek area in Humboldt County, a grove of old-growth redwoods that covered several thousand acres. Before 1906, this area had been logged selectively. After the earthquake, the entire remaining grove was logged. By 1908, virtually every commercially valuable tree in Bull Creek had been cut. The landscape went from dense, old-growth forest to bare hillsides with stumps and slash debris in less than 2 years. The Bull Creek Grove before logging was described by a forestry survey in 1904. The trees averaged 200 feet in height, with many specimens reaching 250 to 300 feet. The diameter at breast height averaged 8 to 12 feet, with the largest trees exceeding 20 feet. The forest canopy was nearly continuous, creating dark, cool conditions at ground level where ferns and redwood sorrel covered the forest floor. The creek itself ran clear and cold, supporting populations of steelhead and salmon that spawned in the gravel. After the 1906 to 1908 logging, the same area was described in a 1910 survey. The old-growth forest was gone. Stumps 10 to 20 feet in diameter covered the hillsides. Logging slash, branches, tops, bark, covered the ground 3 to 6 feet deep in many areas. The slash was dry and created extreme fire hazard. The creek ran brown with sediment from the exposed soil. The steep slopes were eroding, with gullies forming where water ran off the bare ground. The report estimated that 95% of the old-growth timber had been removed, with only the most inaccessible trees in steep ravines remaining. Another major source was the Russian Gulch area in Mendocino County. This forest had been largely untouched before 1906. The trees were enormous, many over 15 feet in diameter. The California Barrel Company held timber rights to this area and began intensive logging after the earthquake. The operation employed over 300 workers and clear-cut several thousand acres between 1906 and 1909. The forest that had taken centuries to grow disappeared in 3 years. The Russian Gulch operation was documented by a journalist who visited in 1907. He described a scene of industrial destruction. The forest is falling to axes and saws at an astounding rate. Everywhere you look, trees are being felled, logs are being hauled, and stumps mark where giants once stood. The sound of axes, saws, and steam donkeys is constant. The smell of fresh-cut redwood permeates the air. The creek runs thick with sawdust and bark. The devastation is total and systematic. In a year, perhaps 2, this forest will be gone entirely. The same journalist interviewed workers about their feelings regarding the destruction. One logger, identified only as Peterson, a Swede, stated, "We are cutting trees that were here before Columbus. Some of these trees were 500 years old when the Pilgrims landed, and we are felling them in a week. I feel the weight of this sometimes. But what am I to do? This is my work. The company pays me to cut trees. They tell me the lumber is needed to rebuild San Francisco. So I cut the trees and try not to think too much about what is being lost."
The Big Basin area in the Santa Cruz Mountains was closer to San Francisco and provided lumber that could be transported cheaply. Several lumber companies operated in this region, cutting old-growth redwood. The San Vicente Lumber Company alone cut over 30 million board feet from Big Basin forests in 1906 and 1907, equivalent to about 6,000 large trees. The cutting was so intensive that conservationists began advocating for protection of the remaining forest, which eventually became Big Basin State Park. The fight to save Big Basin began in 1900, when photographers and naturalists documented the forest's beauty. But it was the post-earthquake logging that created urgency. Conservationists argued that at the current rate of cutting, the entire forest would be gone within 5 years. They organized public campaigns, raised funds to purchase land, and lobbied the California legislature. In 1902, Big Basin became California's first state park, protecting about 18,000 acres. But this protection came after significant logging had already occurred. The park boundaries were drawn around remaining old growth, excluding areas that had been logged. The Mendocino Coast forests north of Fort Bragg were another major source. The Union Lumber Company operated several camps in this region, shipping lumber directly from Fort Bragg Harbor to San Francisco. Company records show production increases from 20 million board feet in 1905 to 38 million in 1907. This production came from an estimated 8,000 trees cut in those 3 years. The company extended its logging railroad into previously uncut areas, accessing timber that would have remained standing for years under normal conditions. The environmental impact of this concentrated logging became visible within months. Heavy winter rains falling on slopes stripped of forest cover caused massive erosion. Creeks that had run clear became muddy torrents. Salmon spawning grounds were buried in sediment. The clear-cut areas became vulnerable to fire. In summer 1907, several major fires burned through logged-over areas, consuming the slash and whatever regeneration had started. The fires were so intense they sterilized the soil in some areas, preventing any regrowth for years. The long-term impact on forest ecosystems was profound. Old-growth redwood forests have specific characteristics. The large trees create microclimates, the forest structure supports particular species, the genetic diversity accumulated over centuries produces resilient populations. When these forests are clear-cut, those characteristics are lost. Second-growth forests that eventually develop are different ecosystems with different species compositions and different ecological functions. The transformation from old growth to second growth is essentially irreversible on human timescales. The documented production increases from 1906 to 1907 show the scale of the response. The Pacific Lumber Company in Humboldt County increased production from 40 million board feet in 1905 to 75 million in 1907, an 87% increase. The Mendocino Lumber Company went from 25 million to 48 million board feet, a 92% increase. Across all operations in Northern California, production increased from approximately 2 billion board feet annually before the earthquake to over 3 billion in 1907. This production increase came at a cost. The logging was less selective and more destructive than previous operations. Before the earthquake, loggers might leave smaller trees and select only the largest, most valuable specimens. After the earthquake, the pressure to maximize output meant cutting everything of commercial size. The slash, branches, bark, and unusable wood, was left on the ground where it dried and created extreme fire hazard. Several major forest fires occurred in logged-over areas in 1907 and 1908, consuming the slash and whatever regeneration had started. The workers in these operations understood what they were doing. They were cutting forests that wouldn't regenerate to their previous state for centuries. But the economic pressure and the perception that San Francisco needed the lumber overrode environmental concerns. The attitude was that the redwood forests were inexhaustible resources to be exploited as needed. The concept of forest conservation existed in 1906, but wasn't widely practiced in commercial logging.
The accident rate in logging operations increased with the accelerated pace. Working longer hours with pressure for maximum production led to fatigue and mistakes. The California Division of Labor Statistics documented a 40% increase in logging accidents in 1906 compared to 1905. The fatality rate among loggers increased from about 2% to 3% annually. For operations employing 1,000 workers, that meant 30 fatalities in 1906 versus 20 in 1905, an additional 10 deaths directly attributable to the increased pace. The rebuilding of San Francisco proceeded rapidly with the lumber supply. By the end of 1906, 8 months after the earthquake, 15,000 buildings had been completed or were under construction. By the end of 1907, 25,000 buildings were complete. By 1910, the city was substantially rebuilt, though construction continued for years. The speed of rebuilding was remarkable and was enabled by the lumber supply that had been ramped up so dramatically. The environmental cost of this rebuilding became apparent over subsequent decades. The forests that had been clear-cut didn't regenerate to old growth. Second-growth forests grew, but with different characteristics: smaller trees, different species composition, more dense undergrowth. Some logged areas never regenerated to forest at all, converting to brush or grassland. The visual impact was striking. Hillsides that had been solid forest became patchworks of bare ground, stumps, and young trees. The conservation movement in California was strengthened by the post-earthquake logging. Conservationists pointed to the devastated forests as evidence that unregulated logging was unsustainable. The Save the Redwoods League was founded in 1918 in direct response to the logging that had accelerated after the earthquake. The League began purchasing and protecting old-growth groves. Many of the redwood parks that exist today were established because the post-earthquake logging made clear that without protection, the forests would all be cut. The economic impact on lumber companies was positive in the short term, but created problems later. The production increases of 1906 to 1908 exhausted many of the most accessible timber stands. By 1910, companies had to go farther and work harder to get logs. The easy timber near railroads and water was gone. This increased costs and reduced profits. Some companies that had expanded during the boom went bankrupt in the subsequent bust, as timber became harder to access and lumber prices returned to normal levels. The workers who had flocked to logging jobs during the boom found employment scarce afterward. The camps that had employed 140 men in 1906 might employ 70 by 1910. The wages dropped from $4 per day back to $3 or less. Many loggers moved to other regions or left logging entirely. The boom-bust cycle was familiar in resource extraction, but the earthquake-driven boom was particularly dramatic. The memory of the forest that disappeared is preserved primarily in photographs. Images from before 1906 show magnificent old-growth redwood forests, dense stands of enormous trees creating cathedral-like spaces beneath their canopies. Images from 1908 and 1909 show the same areas logged bare, nothing but stumps and slash covering hillsides. The contrast is stark and disturbing. These photographs document what was sacrificed to rebuild San Francisco. Some specific groves became legendary among conservationists as examples of what was lost. The Dyerville Giant, a massive redwood in Humboldt County, fell during a storm in 1991 at an age estimated at 1,600 years. It had survived the 1906 logging because its location was slightly too difficult to access economically at that time. But nearby trees that were equally old and impressive were cut in 1907 and 1908. The Dyerville Giant survived by chance and became a symbol of what the forests once contained. The industry perspective on the post-earthquake logging was that it was necessary and appropriate. The lumber companies saw themselves as providing essential materials for rebuilding a devastated city.
The fact that they profited enormously was beside the point. They were meeting a critical need. From this perspective, cutting the forest was justified by the humanitarian need to house displaced people and restore economic activity. This utilitarian view dominated thinking at the time. The alternative perspective, which developed over subsequent decades, was that the scale and speed of logging was excessive. Yes, San Francisco needed lumber, but did it need to be supplied by clear-cutting entire forests with no regard for sustainability? Could selective logging have supplied adequate lumber while preserving some of the forest? These questions weren't seriously asked in 1906, but became central to forest management debates in later decades. The 50,000 tree number in our title is conservative. The actual number of trees cut to supply San Francisco's rebuild was probably much higher, perhaps 100,000 or more large trees over the 2 years of intense logging from 1906 to 1908. Each large building might use the wood from 50 trees, each house from 10 to 20 trees. Multiply that across 28,000 buildings, and the number becomes staggering. An entire region's forests were transformed from old growth to logged-over land in less than 2 years. Today, if you visit the redwood forests of Northern California, you're mostly seeing second growth, forests that have regenerated after logging. True old growth, where trees are 500 to 2,000 years old, exists only in protected groves. These groves are magnificent and give a sense of what the forests were like before industrial logging. But they're remnants. The vast majority of the old growth was cut, much of it in the rush to rebuild San Francisco after 1906. The workers who cut those trees, men like Henrik Larsen and the thousands of others whose names weren't recorded, were doing what workers do. They were earning wages, supporting families, taking available jobs. The environmental destruction wasn't their decision or their responsibility. They were working within an economic system that valued immediate lumber production over forest preservation. Blaming the workers for the outcome would be misplaced. The responsibility lies with the economic and social systems that prioritized exploitation over conservation. San Francisco today is a beautiful city, largely rebuilt in the classical style that came from the 1906 to 1910 reconstruction. The buildings are substantial, many still standing after over a century. The city works and thrives. But underlying that city, literally supporting it, are the forests that disappeared. The redwood timbers in buildings throughout San Francisco came from trees that were ancient when they were cut. Some of those trees started growing before European settlement of North America. They survived storms, fires, droughts for centuries, only to be cut in days to provide lumber for reconstruction. That's the transaction that occurred. Forests for city, old growth for buildings, natural capital converted to economic capital. It was deemed necessary at the time, and perhaps there was no alternative that would have allowed the rapid rebuilding that occurred. But the cost was real and permanent. Those forests will never regenerate to what they were. The genetic diversity contained in old-growth forests was lost. The ecological functions they provided were disrupted. Species dependent on old-growth habitat were displaced or eliminated. The legacy is visible in both the city and the forests. San Francisco exists as it does because of the lumber supplied after the earthquake. The forests exist as they do, mostly second growth or protected remnants, because of the logging that supplied that lumber. The two are inseparably linked. You cannot understand San Francisco's reconstruction without understanding where the lumber came from. And you cannot understand California's forests without understanding how they were exploited to rebuild the city. 50,000 trees, a conservative estimate, gone in less than 2 years. Cut down, milled into lumber, shipped to San Francisco, built into buildings that still stand. The trees that built San Francisco are forgotten. Most people have no idea where the lumber came from. But the evidence exists in stumps scattered through Northern California forests, in old photographs showing devastated hillsides, in the lumber company records documenting the extraordinary production increases. An entire city rebuilt at the expense of centuries-old forests. That's what happened after the San Francisco earthquake, and that's what's worth remembering.